Welcome to my channel. Have you ever noticed that when someone speaks English to you, your brain first translates everything into your own language before you understand it? And when you want to speak, you create the sentence in your language first and then try to change it into English. This small habit is the reason why many learners stay stuck for years. But what if you could train your brain to think directly in English? Imagine understanding English without translating. Imagine answering questions faster. Imagine speaking with more confidence and less stress. In this video, I will show you the difference between your mind before thinking in English and after thinking in English. You will discover why most learners struggle, what changes inside the brain during the learning process, and the simple habits that can completely transform your English. So stay with me until the end, because the final lesson may change the way you practice English forever. Chapter 1. Now, before we learn how to think in English, we first need to understand why most learners cannot think in English naturally. This is one of the biggest problems that English learners face all around the world. And the interesting thing is that many learners do not even realize that they are making this mistake every single day. Imagine that someone asks you a very simple question in English. Maybe they ask, "How was your day?" Instead of answering immediately, something happens inside your mind. First, you hear the English question. Then, your brain translates the question into your own language. After that, you create an answer in your language. Then, you try to translate that answer back into English. Finally, you speak. This process may only take a few seconds, but those few seconds can make a huge difference. While your brain is busy translating, the conversation keeps moving. Other people continue speaking. And you may start feeling nervous because you cannot respond quickly enough. This is exactly what happens to most English learners. They are not actually speaking English. They are translating English. And there is a very big difference between the two. Many learners think that they cannot speak English because they do not know enough grammar. Some people believe that they need to memorize thousands of words before they can become fluent. Others think that fluent speakers are simply smarter. But in many cases, the real problem is much simpler than that. The real problem is that the brain has developed a translation habit. Think about it for a moment. Since childhood, you have been using your own language every day. Your brain is very comfortable with it. Whenever you see something, hear something, or feel something, your brain automatically understands it in your native language. Then, when you start learning English, your brain tries to use the same system. It keeps going back to your native language because that feels safe and familiar. For example, imagine you see a beautiful flower. A fluent English speaker may simply think, "That flower looks beautiful." But many learners first think about the sentence in their own language and then try to change it into English. This extra step makes everything slower. The same thing happens while listening. You hear an English sentence, but instead of understanding it directly, you wait for your brain to translate it. Sometimes the speaker has already said 3 more sentences before you finish translating the first one. Because of this, listening can feel difficult and stressful. And here is something very important that you should remember. If this happens to you, do not feel discouraged. Do not think that you are a bad English learner. In fact, almost every English learner goes through this stage. Even people who speak English fluently today were once beginners. They also translated words. They also felt confused. They also struggled to answer simple questions. The difference is that they slowly trained their brains to stop depending on translation. Language learning is very similar to learning how to ride a bicycle. At first, everything feels difficult. You think carefully about every movement. You worry about making mistakes. But after enough practice, your actions become automatic. You no longer think about every small step. You simply ride. The same thing happens with English. At the beginning, your brain wants to translate everything. But with the right practice, English slowly becomes more natural. Little by little, your brain starts understanding English directly. You begin recognizing words faster. You begin creating simple sentences more easily. And one day, something amazing starts to happen. You hear English and understand it immediately. You speak a simple sentence without translating first. It may only be one sentence, but that moment feels incredible because it shows that your brain is changing. That is why understanding this problem is so important. You cannot fix a problem if you do not know what is causing it. And now you know the truth. The biggest obstacle for many learners is not grammar. It is not vocabulary. It is not intelligence. It is the habit of translating everything. The good news is that habits can be changed. Your brain can learn a new way of thinking. And in the next chapter, I am going to show you exactly what happens inside your mind before you start thinking in English. Once you understand this process, you will finally see why speaking feels difficult now and how it can become much easier in the future. Chapter 2. Now that you understand why translation can slow down your English, let us look more closely at what your mind looks like before you start thinking in English. This is a stage that almost every English learner experiences. In fact, you may be going through this stage right now without even realizing it. Imagine that you are sitting with a friend who speaks English. Suddenly, your friend asks a simple question. Maybe they say, "What did you do yesterday?" The question is not difficult. You know the words. You understand the grammar. But for some reason, your answer does not come out quickly. Instead, your brain starts working very hard. First, you translate the question into your own language. Then, you think about your answer in your own language. After that, you search for the English words you need. Then, you try to arrange those words into a correct sentence. Finally, you speak. By the time you finish this process, several seconds may have passed. To other people, it may look like you do not know English, but the truth is very different. You know English. The problem is that your brain is taking a very long route to reach the answer. This is exactly how many learners think before they develop the habit of thinking in English. Another common problem happens when learners try to speak. They often know many English words, but those words feel locked inside their minds. When they study alone, everything seems easy. They read English, they learn vocabulary, they complete grammar exercises. Everything feels fine. But when it is time to speak, something changes. Suddenly, the mind becomes crowded. Too many thoughts appear at the same time. The learner starts worrying about grammar. They worry about vocabulary. They worry about pronunciation. They worry about making mistakes. Because of all this pressure, speaking becomes difficult. Sometimes learners know exactly what they want to say, but they cannot say it quickly enough. This can be very frustrating. You may have experienced this yourself. Maybe you were watching an English video and understood most of it. Maybe you were reading an English article and felt confident. But when someone asked you a simple question in English, your mind suddenly became blank. Many learners think this means they are not improving. But that is not true. The real reason is that understanding English and thinking in English are not exactly the same thing. When you understand English, you are receiving information. But when you think in English, you are creating information directly in English. This requires a different skill. Now imagine another situation. You are walking outside and you see a beautiful park. What is the first thing that comes into your mind? For many learners, the first thought appears in their native language. Then they try to convert that thought into English. This habit may seem small, but it affects everything. It affects speaking. It affects listening. It affects confidence. And it affects fluency. The brain becomes so busy translating that it has very little energy left for natural communication. This is also why many learners feel tired after speaking English for only a few minutes. Their brains are doing double work. They are thinking in one language and speaking in another language at the same time. Now, here is something very important that most learners never realize. The goal is not to stop making mistakes. The goal is not to speak perfect English immediately. The goal is to slowly teach your brain that English can be used directly. When children learn their first language, they do not translate anything. They connect words directly to objects, actions, feelings, and experiences. That is why speaking feels natural to them. The good news is that your brain can learn English in a similar way. At first, the change will be very small. Maybe you will think of one English word without translating. Then, you will think of a short phrase. Then, a simple sentence. Over time, these small moments become bigger and bigger. But before that transformation happens, every learner must pass through this stage. The stage where the brain still depends heavily on translation. And if you are currently in this stage, do not worry. You are not stuck. You are not failing. You are simply standing at the beginning of an important journey. Because in the next chapter, we're going to talk about something exciting. We're going to explore the first signs that show your brain is starting to think in English. These signs may seem small at first, but they are actually powerful proof that your English is improving in the right direction. Chapter 3. Now, after understanding what happens before you start thinking in English, it is time to talk about something exciting. This is the stage where many learners begin noticing small changes inside their minds. These changes may seem tiny at first, but they are actually signs that your brain is starting to think in English. And here is something very important. Many learners completely miss these signs. They expect a huge change overnight. They expect to wake up one morning and suddenly become fluent. When that does not happen, they think they are not improving. But language learning does not work like that. Real progress usually starts with very small moments. And those small moments are often the beginning of something amazing. For example, Imagine that you are watching an English video. Normally, you would hear a sentence and immediately translate it into your own language. But one day, something different happens. You hear a simple sentence and understand it instantly. There is no translation. There is no extra thinking. You simply understand it. The moment may only last for a few seconds, but it is a very important moment. It means your brain is starting to connect directly with English. Another sign appears when you learn new vocabulary. In the past, whenever you learned a new word, you probably connected it to a word in your native language. But now, you may start connecting the English word directly to an image, an action, or a feeling. For example, when you hear the word apple, you may immediately picture a red apple in your mind. You do not need to think about the meaning in your own language first. This is exactly how fluent speakers understand language. And when your brain starts doing this, it is a clear sign that you are moving in the right direction. There is another exciting sign that many learners experience. Sometimes, while walking, studying, or doing daily activities, an English word suddenly appears in your mind. Maybe you see dark clouds and think, it might rain today. Maybe you look at your breakfast and think, this looks delicious. Maybe you wake up in the morning and think, I am feeling tired. These thoughts may be very simple, but they are extremely powerful. Why? Because your brain is beginning to create thoughts directly in English. At first, these moments happen rarely. Maybe once a day, maybe once a week. But over time, they happen more often. And every time they happen, your English thinking ability becomes stronger. Another sign is that speaking starts feeling slightly easier. Now, this does not mean you become fluent immediately. You may still make mistakes. You may still forget words. You may still feel nervous sometimes. But something starts changing. You notice that some simple sentences come out faster than before. You do not have to build every sentence from the beginning. Some phrases start feeling natural. For example, expressions like, I think so, I don't know, maybe later, or that sounds good, begin coming into your mind automatically. This is another sign that your brain is building English habits. Now, here is where many learners make a big mistake. They see these small improvements and then become impatient. They think, why am I not fluent yet? They think, why do I still make mistakes? And because they do not see perfect results, they stop practicing. But this is exactly the time when they should continue. Think about learning to drive a car. At first, every movement feels difficult. You think about the steering wheel, you think about the pedals, you think about the road. Everything requires effort. But after enough practice, driving becomes natural. The same thing happens with English. Every small English thought is helping your brain create a new pathway. Every simple sentence is training your mind. Every moment without translation is making English feel more natural. That is why consistency is so important. Even if your progress feels slow, your brain is changing every day. And one day, you suddenly realize something incredible. You answered a question in English without translating first. You understood a short conversation immediately. You expressed an idea naturally. And when that happens, you feel a new level of confidence. You begin realizing that English is no longer just something you study. It is becoming something you can actually use. But the most exciting part is that these are only the first signs. The real transformation happens later. Because once your brain becomes more comfortable thinking in English, speaking starts becoming faster, listening becomes easier, and communication feels much more natural. And that is exactly what we are going to explore in the next chapter, where you will discover what happens after you start thinking in English and why that moment can completely change your English learning journey. Chapter 4. Now let us talk about one of the most exciting parts of this journey. We have already discussed what happens before you think in English. We have also talked about the first signs that show your brain is starting to change. But now comes the moment that every English learner dreams about. What happens after you start thinking in English? This is the stage where English begins feeling less like a subject and more like a real language that you can use naturally. And the amazing thing is that the change often happens little by little. At first, you may not even notice it. But one day, something surprising happens. Someone asks you a question in English. And before you have time to translate, the answer comes into your mind automatically. You simply respond. You do not stop to build the sentence. You do not search for every word. You just speak. For many learners, this moment feels unbelievable, because for years, they believed that speaking English would always feel difficult. But now, they finally experience what natural communication feels like. One of the biggest changes happens in speaking. Before thinking in English, speaking often feels slow and stressful. Your brain is constantly translating. It is trying to remember grammar rules. It is searching for vocabulary. Everything feels like hard work. But after you begin thinking in English, speaking becomes much smoother. This does not mean every sentence is perfect. You may still make mistakes. You may still forget words sometimes. Even fluent speakers make mistakes. The difference is that you keep talking. You no longer stop after every few words. Your thoughts begin flowing more naturally. And that makes a huge difference. Another big change happens in listening. Many learners struggle with listening because they are translating every sentence they hear. While they are translating one sentence, the speaker has already said several more. This creates confusion. But when you start thinking in English, your brain becomes faster. Instead of translating every word, you begin understanding the overall message directly. Listening starts feeling easier. English conversations no longer sound like a fast stream of confusing sounds. Instead, they start sounding like meaningful ideas. And that is a wonderful feeling. There is another change that surprises many learners. Reading becomes faster too. Before, you may have stopped frequently while reading English. You may have translated difficult words into your own language. You may have felt tired after reading only a few paragraphs. But after developing the habit of thinking in English, you begin understanding more directly. Your eyes move through the text more smoothly. Your brain spends less time translating and more time understanding. As a result, reading becomes more enjoyable. But perhaps the biggest change of all is confidence. Many learners believe confidence comes first. They think they need confidence before they can speak English. But often, confidence comes after practice. Every time you understand English directly, your confidence grows. Every time you speak without translating, your confidence grows. Every time you express an idea successfully, your confidence grows. Slowly, you stop being afraid of English. You stop seeing English as a difficult challenge. Instead, you start seeing it as a useful tool for communication. Imagine meeting someone who speaks English. Before, you may have felt nervous. You may have worried about every mistake. You may have stayed silent because you were afraid. But now something changes. You focus less on being perfect and more on sharing your ideas. That simple shift can completely transform your learning experience. Now here is something very important. Thinking in English does not mean you never use your native language again. That is not the goal. The goal is simply to reduce your dependence on translation. The goal is to create a direct connection between English words and your thoughts. And when that connection becomes stronger, communication becomes easier. You start noticing English around you more often. You start creating small English thoughts throughout the day. You start reacting naturally to English without forcing yourself. And perhaps the most exciting moment comes when you suddenly realize something. You are thinking in English without trying. Maybe while walking outside. Maybe while watching a video. Maybe while talking to yourself. The English thoughts simply appear. And when that happens, you realize that your brain has changed. The habit of translation is becoming weaker. The habit of thinking in English is becoming stronger. That is the moment when many learners truly begin enjoying English. But now you may be wondering something important. How do you actually train your brain to reach this stage faster? What daily habits help create this transformation? The answer is simpler than most people think. And in the next chapter, I am going to show you 5 powerful daily habits that can train your brain to think in English naturally and help you move closer to real fluency every single day. Chapter 5. Now you understand what happens before thinking in English and what happens after thinking in English. But there is one important question left. How do you actually train your brain to think in English? The good news is that you do not need expensive courses. You do not need perfect grammar. And you do not need to study for 10 hours every day. What you really need are simple daily habits. Small habits may not look powerful at first, but when you repeat them every day, they slowly change the way your brain works. So let us look at 5 simple habits that can help train your brain to think in English naturally. The first habit is called Name Everything Around You. This is one of the easiest exercises you can do. Right now, look around your room. Maybe you see a chair. Maybe you see a table. Maybe you see a phone, a bottle, a window, or a bag. Instead of thinking about these objects in your own language, try naming them directly in English. Then take one more step. Create simple sentences. You can say, "The chair is near the table." You can say, "My phone is on the desk." You can say, "The window is open." These sentences may seem very basic, but they are teaching your brain something important. They are teaching your brain to connect directly with English. The second habit is talk to yourself in English. Many learners avoid this exercise because it feels strange at first. But it is actually one of the most powerful habits you can build. When you are alone, there is no pressure. Nobody is judging you. Nobody is correcting you. You can practice freely. For example, when you wake up in the morning, say simple things in English. You can think, I need to get out of bed. You can think, I am feeling sleepy. While making breakfast, you can say, I am making tea. While walking outside, you can describe what you see. The goal is not perfect English. The goal is to create English thoughts throughout the day. The third habit is use pictures instead of translation. This habit can completely change the way you learn vocabulary. Whenever you learn a new word, do not immediately connect it to your own language. Instead, connect it to a picture, an action, or a feeling. For example, when you hear the word happy, imagine a smiling person. When you hear the word run, imagine someone running quickly. When you hear the word cold, imagine standing outside on a winter morning. Your brain understands images very quickly, and the more you connect English words to images, the less you depend on translation. The fourth habit is listen and repeat immediately. Choose simple English content that you can understand comfortably. Listen to one sentence. Pause the audio. Then repeat the sentence. Try to copy the pronunciation, the speed, and the feeling. For example, if the speaker says, I don't know what happened, pause and repeat exactly the same sentence. This exercise teaches your brain to react faster in English. It helps your mouth and your mind work together. And over time, speaking becomes much more natural. Now let us talk about the fifth habit. And honestly, this may be the most powerful one of all. This habit is called live small moments in English. Choose a few minutes every day when you think only in English. For example, while brushing your teeth, describe your actions in English. While eating food, think about the taste in English. While walking outside, describe the weather, the people, and the buildings around you. You might think, the sky looks beautiful today. You might think, the street is busy. You might think, that car is very fast. At first, your brain may feel tired. That is completely normal. Remember, you are building a new habit, and every new habit requires practice. Now, here is something very important. Do not try to become perfect. Many learners stop practicing because they make mistakes. But mistakes are a normal part of learning. What matters most is consistency. 5 minutes every day is better than 1 hour once a week. Small daily practice creates lasting improvement. Your brain learns through repetition. The more often you think in English, the more natural English becomes. And after enough practice, something amazing begins to happen. English thoughts start appearing automatically. You no longer need to force them. Your brain begins using English naturally. That is when real progress starts becoming visible. And in the next chapter, we are going to imagine the future version of you. The version that has continued practicing these habits for months. The version that thinks in English more naturally. The version that feels confident while speaking. And that future may be much closer than you think. Chapter 6. Now, before we finish this lesson, I want you to imagine something very important. Imagine yourself 6 months from today, not tomorrow, not next week, but 6 months from now. Imagine that you followed the habits we discussed in the previous chapter. You named objects around you in English. You talked to yourself in English every day. You used pictures instead of translation. You listened and repeated simple English sentences. And you spent a few minutes every day thinking only in English. At first, the changes were small. Some days felt easy, some days felt difficult. Sometimes you felt confident. Sometimes you felt frustrated. But you kept going. You continued practicing even when progress felt slow. And because of that, something incredible started happening. Your brain slowly became more comfortable with English. Now imagine waking up in the morning. The first thoughts that come into your mind are simple English thoughts. You think, I need to get ready. You think, today looks like a good day. You think, I have a lot to do. You are not forcing these thoughts. They simply appear naturally. A few months ago, this would have seemed impossible. But now it feels normal. Then imagine watching an English video. Before, you had to translate many words. You often paused the video. You sometimes felt lost. But now you understand much more without translating. You focus on the message instead of individual words. Listening feels easier. And because listening feels easier, you enjoy it more. Now imagine having a conversation in English. Before, every question felt like a challenge. You worried about grammar. You worried about vocabulary. You worried about making mistakes. Sometimes you stayed silent because you were afraid. But now something has changed. You still make mistakes occasionally. That is completely normal. But mistakes no longer stop you. You continue speaking. You continue expressing your ideas. And most importantly, you feel more confident. This confidence did not appear overnight. It was built one small practice session at a time, one simple English thought at a time, one small sentence at a time. That is how real fluency grows. Many learners imagine fluency as a magical moment. They think one day they will suddenly become perfect. But fluency does not usually happen like that. Instead, it grows slowly. It grows through daily habits. It grows through repetition. It grows through patience. And one day you look back and realize how far you have come. You realize that English no longer feels as difficult as it once did. You realize that understanding English is easier. You realize that speaking feels more natural. And that realization feels amazing. Now here is something that I want you to remember forever. Thinking in English is not the final reward. Thinking in English is the path. Many learners wait until they become fluent before trying to think in English. But the truth is the opposite. You become fluent because you start thinking in English. Every English thought is helping your brain grow stronger. Every simple sentence is creating a new habit. Every moment without translation is moving you closer to fluency. So never underestimate small progress. A single English thought may seem unimportant today, But hundreds of small English thoughts can completely transform your language skills over time. Remember the learner we talked about at the beginning of this video, the learner who translated every sentence, the learner who hesitated before speaking, the learner who felt nervous during conversations. That learner can change, and that change starts with small daily actions. The future version of you is not created in one day. It is created through consistent practice. It is created through patience. It is created through effort. And if you continue showing up every day, your future self will thank you for not giving up. One day you will answer a question in English without translating. One day you will understand a conversation naturally. One day English will feel like a normal part of your life. And when that day comes, you will realize that every small step was worth it. So keep practicing, keep learning, keep thinking in English. Because the future version of you who speaks English confidently is already being built today, one thought at a time.